Good afternoon. My name is Curtis Lindsay, and today I'll be talking to you a little bit about the 6 cultural dimensions brought to us by Dr. Hofsted. And in these 6 cultural dimensions, I'll be talking about that of South Africa and comparing and contrasting the scores that they received to the scores of the United States. First, I'll talk about what are the 6 cultural dimensions, and then I'll go into talking about the scores that South Africa has received compared to the United States. First, I'll talk about what are the 6 cultural dimensions. They are power distance, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation versus short-term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. Power distance basically is when members of a society have feelings about hierarchy. If you're on the lower end of this perspective, then that means that you feel like that your society is based off a hierarchy and there's really no possibility of it becoming equal. But if you're on the higher end of this perspective, then you feel like you strive and you try to do what you can to make sure that the society becomes equal. Individualism versus collectivism. If a country is on the higher end of this, then that means they are a loose-knit society and they focus more on self rather than more on their family. In contrast to that, if you're on the lower end of this, then you're more family orientated and you focus on helping your immediate family out rather than just going all for self. Next is a masculinity versus feminist society, or femininity, I should say. If you're on the higher end of the aspect and you're a masculine society, that means you focus more on achievement, status, assertiveness. And if you're on the lower end and you have a femininity cultural dimension, that means that this country is more caring and they are more focused on the quality of life. Next, we'll go to uncertainty avoidance. This aspect is just basically the country is uncertain about the future. They don't know what's going to happen, so they focus more on the now. And if you're on the lower end of it, then you have more of a free culture. They don't try to control what happens in the future. And if you're on the higher end, then this country, they have more rigid codes, and they're just more strict rather than the lower score, they're just being more of a relaxed country. And long-term orientation versus short-term orientation is basically saying that all countries have links and ties back to their own past of what happened. Lower scores, they prefer to maintain time-honored tradition, and higher scores, they have more efforts in modern education to prepare for the future. And lastly, for indulgence versus restraint, it's pretty self-explanatory. Having an indulgent culture means that you want to enjoy life more than that you just focus on having fun. And having a restraint culture is more strict social norms, and it's just a more strict society. So now with that being said, I'll go towards the scores from South Africa compared to the United States. The scores are pretty similar across the board, except for one aspect, which I'll get into in a second, which is individualism versus collectivism. The United States is way ahead in that aspect. But I'll start from the top, which is power distance. South Africa has a score of 49 compared to the score of the United States, which has a 40. So we feel that we are striving to try to become equal. We know that it's not all the way equal, but we both as a society want to try to make things equal. So we strive in government to try to make things equal. Next is the individualism versus collectivism. South Africa has a score of 65 and the United States has a score of 91. So basically the United States is more self-orientated. We're more about us individually trying to get our achievements, our status before we focus on our family. And South Africa is more family orientation than the United States. Next, I'll talk about masculinity versus femininity. We're pretty equal, 63-62. We're both a masculine society. Then uncertainty avoidance, we're pretty equal there as well, 49-46. South Africa and the United States respectively. Then long-term orientation, we're also pretty equal, 34-26. And lastly, indulgence versus restraint. We're both a pretty free countries. We live for the now rather than focusing on the later. And we just love to have fun. And based off of those, I've learned a good bit about South Africa, that it's pretty similar to that of the United States. We still have a lot of differences, individualism being the huge difference between the two countries. But all in all, that we're pretty similar in certain aspects, more than I would have thought before I gotten to focus on this and just take the time out to learn a little bit about the cultural dimensions. This is my time, and I thank you for listening to me.